Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we are talking about the latest in the pile of wars that are upon us, that of the U.S. and Israel against Iran. We are fortunate to have back with us on Talk World Radio Norman Solomon, who is a co-founder and the national director at RootsAction.org, where I also work. And Norman Solomon is the author of many excellent books, perhaps the most relevant right now, War Made Invisible. Norman Solomon, welcome back to Talk World Radio.
Hey, thanks a lot, David.
Thanks for being here. What can you tell us about this war on Iran and how they've gone about starting it?
The way it's been started is just, as the saying goes, naked aggression. It's just, we can do it. We want to do it. Might makes right. And these two hugely powerful air forces, arguably the most powerful in the world, the U.S. and Israel, just has gone ahead and begun to terrorize and slaughter people, not just in military bases, but also in the biggest urban areas. I was in Tehran a while ago, actually more than 15 years ago, and it's just hard to imagine. I mean, when I have visited New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, D.C., how could I have thought that bombs would be falling down and blowing people up on purpose because of some foreign power deciding to try to dominate that or our country? So it's unimaginable. And the U.S. Is populated by people largely we can't even imagine it. And yet the United States government is making it happen.
It's almost, you say naked aggression. It's almost as if they don't put much effort into the lies anymore. They don't bother to try to actually fool anyone, and they apparently don't, looking at the polls, and yet they just don't seem to care and go ahead anyway. Is that what it looks like to you?
Shameless is a appropriate description. You mentioned my book, War Made Invisible, and people listening and watching to us here might be feeling, well, what's invisible about this war? It's on our TV or other screens. We're hearing about it on the radio. It's print outlets and so forth. Well, that's just clueless presentation of what war actually is. I mean, we are unaware, if we depend on news media, what a war is. And so it's this illusion that we have visibility and understanding of what this war and other wars are. In fact, it's sort of a pantomime. It's what's the saying, Potemkin Village presentation through the U.S. news media and the rhetoric of politicians. I have to say, even those in Congress, with few exceptions, who happen to be denouncing this aggression by the U.S. and Israel, rarely convey the kind of outrage and moral fury that would be appropriate. And so almost everything is tamped down. And I think that's the nature of, for one thing, the U.S. news media and politics and the media in virtually all countries where the government is waging war and the news media are subservient and deferential to it. And it also, I think, is especially pernicious when it comes to air war, which, after all, as we speak, is the only way in which the U.S. and Israel are killing people in Iran. And so there's this technological sense of superiority, which exists technically, but it then morphs into and merges into a sense of moral superiority. And we have a right to do this because we've got the technology to do it. We have the strongest air forces in the world. So, hey, what's your problem with it? And that's sort of implicit. And it's certainly inbred into the U.S. culture of politics and media to a very large extent.
It seems like intelligent, informed people who pay attention to the news but are not exactly interested in opposing wars, or haven't been up till now anyway, sort of understand this one, that there's no good excuse for it. And yet they seem pretty well completely fooled into imagining that there is an opposition party in Washington, D.C., in Congress, that's been doing everything physically possible to try to prevent this war and is rushing to get a war powers resolution vote as soon as possible. And yet there was a lot of reporting, Aida Chavez and other reporters, on the delaying tactics of the Democrats, of Schumer and Jeffries and the Democrats on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, trying to prevent a war powers resolution vote before the war could get started. And of course, Schumer out there for weeks and months and years and decades, got to be tougher, no side deals for peace, got to stand up to Iran and stop hemming and hawing and get tough on Iran. Like, how do the Democrats? I don't mean people who call themselves Democrats, but I mean Schumer and Jeffries. How do these people go about facilitating this war and at the same time manage to sell themselves to the public as opposing it?
Well, the metaphor talk out of both sides of mouth really applies. We have had exceptional people, and that's the good and bad news that someone like Ro Khanna is exceptional. It's the exception where he is a Democrat who has been fighting really hard to stop this war from happening, this war on Iran, and then trying to end it. But he is in a minority, even within his own party, really determined as best he can to stop the war. And as you mentioned, the minority leaders of the House and Senate, the Democrats, Schumer and Jeffries, it's beyond disgraceful because when you actually look at what they're saying, even after the attack, let alone before the attack, when there was an effort to put a war powers resolution into effect, that's just understated to such an extreme. It's very procedural. Yes, there is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. They will invoke it or talk about it that, yes, it's Congress that gets to declare war, not the executive branch, not the president. But still in all, when you actually look at and listen to what they say, it's very much about, well, we need to go through the proper procedures. And there's for one thing, they're not really insisting on proper procedures of congressional power. And also, it's so understated in contrast to when, for instance, Israel was attacked by Hamas on October 7th. And appropriately, there was outrage. But this double standard, this double level of some people's lives really, really matter. And some people's lives really, really don't, implicitly or explicitly. And so that is really animating and distorting the political picture. And it's up to people at the grassroots, organizers. And David, you mentioned we're both with RootsAction. People will sign up to rootsaction.org for action alerts. You also are in leadership of World Beyond War. These are two among many really crucial grassroots organizations. The wars that are started in Washington are never stopped there. You can go from Vietnam to the present day. To the extent they have been stopped, it's because people organize. And to get back to the point of air war, there is a conscious strategy from the war makers in Washington, recognizing that, quote, boots on the ground have become very unpopular, to just rely on the technological capacity to terrorize and kill from the air. And that is supposed to ameliorate concerns. And to the extent that people are upset, we should be more upset because it doesn't matter how you're killing people. The fact is you're doing it, and the terrorizing of civilians, the slaughtering of them has gotten underway thanks to U.S. taxpayers in Iran.
The Hill newspaper, I think, sent me an email, as they send to everyone, with a big headline and the count of the death count in this war thus far. And it had gone up, I think, from 3 to 6, because the death count is, U.S. people, while meanwhile they're blowing up schools and stadiums and public squares and apartment buildings and killing people by the hundreds, men, women, and children. I'm getting news from U.S. media about the death count having reached 6.
Yeah, the bigger headlines are about the few Americans who have died in this war, and the smaller headlines, much less downplayed by far, is, as you mentioned, you kill 100 girls at a school in Iran. Yes, it's a story, but a passing story. Doesn't seem to have the political resonance, and a lot of the analysts about the politics on Capitol Hill and in Washington generally are telling us these the supposedly wisest people in the punditocracy and journalism that, oh, if Americans start dying, then it could become a bigger political problem. Well, it's our responsibility to make it a political problem when the United States leads the way to wage an aggressive war, which, after all, after World War II, at the Nuremberg trials, the judgment of the judges was that the supreme international crime was to wage an aggressive war. And we're told frequently when a new president comes in, Obama said it when he came into power. Biden essentially said it in policy. We need to look forward, not backward. That's not what the Nuremberg trial came up with. It said that when these crimes are committed, there needs to be accountability, because if there isn't accountability, it foreshadowed repetition. And what we have with the warfare state in the US is what we could call a repetition compulsion disorder. That disorder of what Dr. King called the madness of militarism is going to continue to the extent that we are unable to organize effectively to stop it.
So, what other than subservience to Israel and Netanyahu and the weapons dealers and the worst person who was recently in a room with Donald Trump is driving this? Because there apparently are lots of complaints from within the US military about commanders telling troops, this is to bring on Armageddon and bring back Jesus Christ. We must destroy the Middle East, and including Israel, by the way, in order to bring. I would think Jesus would have been here by now if U.S. mass killing was like the bat signal for Jesus. But how big a factor is this particular madness?
Well, David Rovics, the singer, has a song, Who Would Jesus Bomb, which is always a good sardonic, salient question. It is a new element that you're referring to, much more significant than it was even 2 years ago. And that is that the Republican crew, now in power, the extreme right wing, has part of its base, and coming to the fore, people like the Secretary of so-called Defense, they're religious fanatics. And so, as you allude to, there's a whole other layer added on to the historic and continuing military industrial complex power. This is all extremely lucrative, of course. And so it's a macabre marriage between extreme evangelical fundamentalists who are running the Pentagon at this point, and the traditional ongoing let's profiteer from killing and preparing for more killing that's been in place for so many decades in the United States. This is one of the taboo areas in terms of U.S. news media coverage. There's been great work done, books written by, for instance, Andrew Coburn about the spoils of war and so forth, really spelling out how lucrative these wars are for a very small number of people and some very large and not so large corporations. But you can read the New York Times and Washington Post and listen to All Things Considered in Morning Edition and watch the PBS NewsHour and on and on. I'm not just talking about right-wing conservative media outlets. I'm talking about so-called mainstream or legacy quality, we're told, media outlets. And this is a virtually forbidden area of discussion, that these wars are blood money for very, very rich people who want to get very, very richer. And so in this case, hey, there's enormous profits to be made. These weapons that are used is more of a way to then resupply. There's talk on Capitol Hill for a, quote, supplemental to appropriate yet more money for this war. But this has been going on for so long. I mean, the Ukraine war has been tremendously lucrative for these entities, the military-industrial complex. And there is a military-industrial complex in Russia as well. And the aggression from Russia, the terrible slaughtering, talk about air power, the terrible slaughtering of civilians by the Russian government in Ukraine. I think what we certainly need among progressive and other forces in the US is a single standard of human rights, and a single standard that says we are going to organize and do everything we can nonviolently to hold these vicious militaristic governments accountable. And that means a single standard and condemning them all and organizing against them.
Couldn't agree more. We're speaking with Norman Solomon from RootsAction, and one of his books is War Made Invisible. And there is a new book out now, Norman, related to our late friend and colleague, Dan Ellsberg. Many people may not know about this yet. Can you tell us what this book is?
It's a compilation of private writings that Daniel Ellsberg wrote over a 50-year period. Of course, Dan became well known suddenly and was condemned and beloved instantly for releasing the Pentagon Papers in 1971. He faced potentially the rest of his life in prison as a whistleblower who exposed the lies, the official lies behind the war on Vietnam. And after he passed away in 2023, his son Michael and his longtime assistant Jan Thomas went through so many of his journals, some of it scrawled. Jan said maybe she was the only person who could read his handwriting other than himself. Some of it was typed. And Michael asked Dan before Dan passed away, would it be okay for us to go through all this writing that you've done privately and curate it and publish selections from what you've written? And Michael recounts that Dan was not enthusiastic, but ultimately said, okay, go ahead. I'll be dead anyway. Feel free to do that. As we speak, the book is just being published in the last few days, and it's available. It's called Truth and Consequence, and it's very much focused on the deference to power and what Dan Ellsberg saw first as a middle level or higher middle level architect of the strategy behind the Vietnam War, who then saw how horrific it was in human terms, how disingenuous it was. And so a lot of the book really focuses on how conscience gets crushed by obedience. And he wrote this, as I say, since the 1970s, what is in this book, Truth and Consequence. And it's right here with us now because there are so many people inside and outside the US government who should be screaming bloody murder because it is bloody murder about what's going on in Iran, courtesy of US taxpayers. And the silence, the deference, the fear of authority, that is fueling the war.
We certainly see a lot of that in Washington and around the country and around the world. And all of these countries that are now targets for Iranian missiles, but have US military bases in them, are speaking up at the UN and denouncing Iran instead of with the exception of Spain, which has said you can't use your bases in Spain for this war. You got to use them for some other horrific war. They've all just bowed down in obedience, and their governments. So it's up to us in the ordinary people, I guess, in the United States to stand up to the US government. I don't know who's going to do it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. You're making a great point. The British, French, and German governments in the last couple of days have all denounced jointly the Iranian government for what they call a disproportionate response to being attacked. What's disproportionate when you have been subjected to this terrible air assault from Israel and the US? They don't really specify. You're reminding me that when I was in Tehran, I was in the souk and walking around, and there was a stand where the man selling underwear, as it happened, was talking with me. He could speak some English, and he said, people really want to have peace, and the governments keep getting in the way of what we want. I remember somehow I have gone to a couple of countries before they've been subjected to this kind of horrific air assault. One was Iran, the other was Iraq before the US invasion took place in 2003. And I had a driver, Iraqi driver who was taking me around. Of course, Saddam Hussein was a terrible tyrant, and people were frightened to say anything out of line. But we were in the middle of a park, just the two of us at a park bench. And he said, I just wish that Iraq didn't have any oil, because if our country didn't have any oil, we wouldn't have to worry about the upcoming invasion by the United States, which I think was very true. If Iraq had major resource of cucumbers instead of oil, it would not have happened, as many leaders eventually in Washington acknowledged. It gets us back to what's this all about? It's about power geopolitical positioning, resources, fanaticism. This is what we should be working to roll back so we can have a humane foreign policy, which would mean a humane society in the United States.
What would Dan Ellsberg be doing tomorrow if he was with us? What
He'd
should
be
we
in
learn
jail
from him?
probably. He had said during the invasion of Iraq, as I recall, and what is that, more than 20 years ago, that he just couldn't stand the idea of not being in jail when his country was committing such horrific crimes against humanity. Of course, it recalls that I don't know if it's apocryphal, maybe it really happened. Thoreau was in jail and he was asked by a friend, "What are you doing in there?" And his response was, "What are you doing out there?" Uh,
By
Civil
Ralph Waldo
disobedience.
Emerson, if I've got the
Yeah,
story right.
I think that's right. Yeah. Uh, we can say, and it's true, there are many, many things that need to be done nonviolently to oppose the militaristic insanity that is in so many parts of the world, including and especially now in the United States. One of them is civil disobedience.
What should people be doing? What should people be telling Congress to do? What should people be telling their local governments to do? And in that regard, what can we learn from what Dan Ellsberg would suggest as a strategy?
He was very into a multiplicity of nonviolent tactics and overall strategies. He said that there's not everything that anybody can do. Nobody can do everything, but everybody doing something really crucial. And so in this time, I think deluging members of Congress are ostensible representatives in the House, the two senators that we all have, unless we live in DC and are deprived as US citizens of basic voting and representational rights. We need to demand that these members of Congress go ahead and cut off funding for this war, and also at the top of their lungs articulate the need to stop this war. There's just too much quiescence in Washington, and we need to go to local, regional, state officials. They need to be part of the outcry also.
There's a case to be made that you get what you pay for, and the US government is putting unprecedented, unfathomable amounts of money into war spending. And Donald Trump wants to up it now suddenly by another 50% from about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion for military spending. In all these years of it going up, 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 and we're hearing the rhetoric from the better members of Congress against it, there's never been any real effort to stop it. Is there some outrageous, dramatic increase that we could get to, like maybe this one, where you might actually see that an actual effort to stop it and reverse it?
There's a saying, when people lead, the leaders will follow. The bad thing about opportunism in Congress is obvious. The not so bad thing is that when the wind really shifts, the windsocks will shift those in office. And so, if you will, so to speak, we need to make it more opportunistic to be against this mass slaughter and military budget that is so huge, rather than for it, which is sort of the reflex position of most members of Congress. Really, we're in a situation where, as a moral document, the federal budget is a profoundly immoral document. And that's where we are. Martin Luther King Jr. described the outlandish military spending in 1967 during the Vietnam War as a destructive, demonic suction tube. That was his phrase. It's an appropriate phrase as we are now in 2026. It's just a kind of a madness that is so normalized. We need to step outside of the madness emphatically to turn it around.
You mentioned Congressman Khanna, who, with others, has just introduced legislation to tax billionaires in order to have a little money for decent things. You could get even more money just by taking it, clawing it back from the military budget. Are people making these connections in large numbers? Militarism is often just set aside as a separate topic.
Yeah, well, I think increasingly among some activist groups and others, those connections are being made. And as you mentioned, with the argument now going national, but I live in California and the ballot measure impending, it looks like, to tax a one-time tax on billionaires, a very mild idea that has caused howls of outrage from some billionaires. A lot of them are especially billionaires because of the military industrial complex. And increasingly, the Silicon Valley wealthy are really entwined with the Pentagon, with the so-called intelligence community. And this is all a big, destructive, terribly destructive ball of wax that we need to acknowledge has these very deep connections.
If I'm not mistaken, though, there's also new legislation in the U.S. Congress, not that it's about to pass anytime soon, on taxing billionaires. Maybe California has a better chance if its governor would get out of the way. We got 2 minutes left. Norman Solomon, I'm remembering 2013, Gallup did a poll. They polled people in dozens of countries. What's the biggest threat to peace in the world? And the winner in the majority of the countries was the United States government. And then the Pew did a similar poll in 2017, similar results, even worse. I don't think any polling company has dared to ask a similar question or at least publish the results since 2017. Can you imagine, though, what the results would be if someone did it?
Well, right now, I think clearly the United States and Israel are the two biggest threats to world peace. There's nothing nationalistic or theological or ideological about it. It's just reality right in front of us. I was saying 2 or 3 years ago that while the US had led the way with aggression, that with the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth in the very early years of this century, that the United States was well ahead, but that Russia, by invading Ukraine, apparently was trying to catch up. And it's sort of a race to the bottom because now what US and Israel are doing, I mean, this is just such a horrific trend that it's up to us to reverse.
It is, and I hope we can do it. And I thank you for everything that you're doing. We've been speaking with Norman Solomon. You should read his books if you haven't, including War Made Invisible and War Made Easy. You should come join him and me at rootsaction.org. Norman, thank you very, very much for coming on Talk World Radio.
Thanks a lot, David.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.